So now the second half of our afternoon is a deeper dive looking specifically at agriculture. Um, why are we focusing on agriculture? Well, it's such an important sector that sits really at the heart of a lot of key sustainability issues. Um, Agriculture is central to building resilience globally against climate change. It feeds into the food system, food security, economic stability. It provides jobs. Farming is obviously central to the human diet and therefore human health. So it's essential that we get this sector right. Agriculture is also part of the problem and part of the solution to a lot of the physical challenges we face in a changing climate. It's linked to biodiversity, the health of soil, resilience to extreme weather. Methane is a major issue. The transportation of food is a huge contributor to global emissions. Chemicals from fertilizers, pesticides, they're all having a really negative effect on soil health and biodiversity. So there's lots of moving parts to this, and it's really essential that we play our role as an insurance industry in trying to help build a more sustainable and resilient agriculture sector. So over the next hour, that's what we're going to be looking at. How can insurers play a role? But first, it's really important to identify where we're trying to get to. So what does the farm of the future actually look like? And that's why we brought in a brilliant guest to do a keynote Q&A with me before our panel session on agriculture. Helen Browning, OBE, who is Chief Executive of the Soil Association. And Helen has been advocating for change in the agriculture sector for a few decades now in various guises. She's also a farmer in her own right. She's transformed her family farm in recent years from traditional approaches to organic and regenerative approaches. So she knows firsthand what it takes to transform a farm into a more sustainable approach. And the Soil Association is a brilliant charity that does work that cuts across environmental and social issues, all linked to sustainability and resilience. So it's brilliant to have Helen here. And once we've discussed what the farm of the future could or should look like, then we'll move on to our panel and we can start talking about what's achievable in the short term and what insurers and brokers can do to de-risk the transition for farmers and help build resilience against climate change. So without further ado, I'll welcome Helen. Helen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Great to be with you.
I think a good place to start would probably be if you could just say a few words about the Soil Association, because it's a brilliant organisation. And I know that your objectives and goals, it serves a much bigger picture than just soil. So perhaps you can just tell us a little bit about the organisation, just for those who aren't familiar.
Well, the Soil Association was founded in 1946. So we've been around for a while now, and we're a charity that was really founded on the mission to understand and educate people around the relationship between soils, plants, animals, and people, and how if you have healthy soil, ultimately you have healthy people. So that was always our sort of mission. And we work on lots of different fronts. Today, we're really focused on the two big transitions we need to see in the world. Taking farmers and foresters towards regenerative ecological farming systems and the way we look after our land, and transitioning everybody to healthy and sustainable diets. So we work both at the production end and at the consumption end. And I think we're renowned over the years for setting standards and running schemes. Organic is the obvious one, but we've run many others like our Food for Life standards and schemes. And I suppose one of the reasons I'm still involved with the Soil Association after all these years, I've been involved with them pretty much all my life in various ways, is because it's such an innovative organization, always coming up with new ways of doing things. And it's also really practical. So we work from the ground up, we influence policy, and we're very much focused on that whole picture, how you actually try and tackle a whole range of issues through different approaches.
So if we look at farming today, we know things need to change, but can you kind of just talk us through what is unsustainable about the traditional farming model, and what some of the implications of these approaches are over the long term on the economy, on society, on resilience, etc.
There's so much to say about this in just a few minutes, but I suppose one of the aspects we've seen is that everything's got very specialized in agriculture. We've gone down a sort of monoculture route where we grow the same things or more or less the same things on the same ground year after year. We rely on 4 or 5 crops around the world to produce the majority of our foodstuffs, and then we manufacture lots of processed foods, ultra processed foods from those few feedstuffs. And those monocrops and that specialization is very bad for the soil. We've seen massive soil degradation across the globe. It's really bad for people's health, and we're getting more and more evidence on that all the time. And in a world where climate change is roaring towards us, it's also really risky if you start to put all your eggs in one basket. So specialization and monoculture is a big problem. We've clear felled our landscapes in so many countries, and we're still chopping down forests at a rate of knots. Again, that makes our soils more vulnerable. It really adds to biodiversity loss rapidly. And it's really affecting the hydrology of our environment. So water scarcity is becoming a big problem. So getting trees back into the landscape is really important. We've relied far too much on chemical inputs as a substitute for good husbandry. From nitrogen fertilizer to all the pesticides that we tend to use. And if you look back over the last 50 years, you'll see so many pesticides that at one time were being used on a really widespread basis in agriculture, then being discredited and found to be really harmful. But it's 20 years too late. And we've polluted our environment with these things. We've oversupplied nitrogen, reactive nitrogen into the system. And things like antibiotics we've overused in our industrial livestock systems so that we're getting resistance in human populations, and we're really affecting our own microbiome, and we're learning a lot more about that as we go too. Industrial livestock is both inhumane, but it also produces a lot of what the industry calls waste. But actually, those manures should be recycled back into the land, and you can do that if animals are living at lower intensity. And it's diverting masses of food that could be feeding people directly into feeding livestock. So industrial livestock's got a lot to answer for. And this has all led to a big biodiversity crash. And biodiversity, wildlife, is not just a nice to have. It's a really important part of the fabric of the environment which sustains us. So, there's just a few examples, and I could give many more, of all of the ways in which we're threatening our very existence on this planet through not looking after our soils, not looking after our environment. And with climate change, the risk levels around this are rising day by day. So without resilient soils and shade and shelter from trees, we won't be able to feed ourselves long term. That's going to lead to conflict over resources. It's going to lead to mass migration like we haven't seen before. We worried about a few small boats. We haven't seen anything yet. So we have fundamentally forgotten to look after the core resource that sustains humanity. And that is going to come back and bite us if we're not very careful.
Let's flip it around. What does the farm of the future look like? What do we need to do to change this?
Well, I think it's really important to say that there will never be one right model for the farm of the future. Everything has to be context specific. Depends on your geography, your social context as well. So there's not just one model that we need to be looking at, but I think it really is important to look at some of the kind of principles that our farms and the way we produce our food needs to adhere to over time. There is a real need to focus on soils. And that's why I'm very keen that we're called the Soil Association, even though we work so broadly, because if we don't look after our soils, we won't be able to feed ourselves. So regenerative farming, organic farming systems, which actually put goodness back into the soils, put the fiber back, the carbon back into our soils so that they hold more water, they hold more nutrients, they feed our plants healthily without needing all the chemical inputs. That's crucially important. We need to think about diverse cropping. Diversity is a really good thing to think about when you're looking at resilient systems. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. We can be growing a much wider range of crops, and that will be good for our health as well. And diversity in terms of people as well coming back onto the land. We need to be thinking about the circular economy within our farms. How do we become less reliant on importing lots of nutrients and products onto the farm when we can actually generate those naturally, the way like we do when we use nitrogen fixing plants like clovers and other leguminous crops to fix the nitrogen from the atmosphere, rather than making it in a factory in a way that is very fossil fuel inefficient. The farm of the future won't need many chemicals because it will have great soils, feeding its plants healthily, and won't be needing all these pesticides, insecticides, herbicides, which we know are so destructive. And for me, one thing that's terribly important, that it will give a good life to our farm animals. If we're going to farm animals, it's both ethically important that we look after them in the right way, but it's also in our self-interest too, because of the antibiotic problem that we've already talked about, and the pandemic risk. So we talk about livestock on leftovers, having animals that help regenerate our soils, do good things for our environment, manage and support biodiversity, but aren't competing with humans for food. Our farm of the future should be mopping up a lot more carbon than it emits. One of the only ways that we have to take carbon out of the atmosphere is through our land, through our soils, our trees, and obviously also through our oceans. So that is going to be a really big focus, I think, for farmers in the future. And clearly, it needs to be non-polluting. We need to make sure that our slurry isn't going into the watercourses, that we are actually looking after those resources well, and providing great access for people. You know, we know how important nature is for people getting out onto the farms, people having meaningful livelihoods on the land, I think will be a big feature of our farms in the future. And hopefully those farms supplying their locality with food, with good, nutritious food, more directly in a more unprocessed form. We need to look at the whole food system, not just the farm itself.
If we can transition to this way of farming on a wide scale, what some of the key benefits will be to society and the environment?
I think they'll be enormous. I mean, farming can become part of the solution to things like climate change and biodiversity loss, rather than the big problem that it is today. So we need to really reverse our role in society. We can be feeding people really well. You know, the health of our products can be much better than it is today. We can be not polluting. Sounds like I'm phrasing everything in the negative, all the things that we're not going to be doing. But actually, you can see a future. You see it on farms in the UK today, which have been organic for a reasonable period of time, where nature is thriving, where people are really involved and active on the land, where there's succession because people want to come work there and kids want to come back to the farm, where there's a healthy rural economy from those thriving sort of nature-friendly farming systems. They can be the bedrock of our rural economy and the bedrock of the health of society.
What are some of the challenges that farmers are going to face in trying to adopt these new approaches? And what do we need to see to kind of accelerate that transition on a sector-wide scale?
I think I'd concentrate on two things: the knowledge gap and the finance gap. And, you know, there's plenty of successful examples, you know, like some of our organic farms, of farmers doing this well. But there's an awful lot more we need to learn and do even better. And one of the challenges we've had historically is that most of the research funding goes into what people call wealth creating products, things that you're going to sell to a farmer, rather than the knowledge rich systems that we need to be supporting. So that's one of the reasons at the Soil Association why we started Innovative Farmers 10, 12 years ago now, which gives small, easy to access grants to farmers who want to get together to research a new challenge, a new opportunity, and supports them with a researcher. But it's really farmer-led approaches which accelerates knowledge transfer really, really fast. But it also creates new knowledge, new ideas that are really in this vein of an agroecological transition. So there's a real need for a lot more of that, a lot more research in the right kind of vein, and advice. Farmers are going to need the advice and support so they feel really confident. We need to de-risk that transition for farmers, so that they feel confident about the steps they can make. And things like Soil Association Exchange is in that vein too, showing what the environmental metrics of a farm looks like and what they can best do in their context to improve. The second area is finance. Most of the research shows that farms do go through an economic dip as they move from sort of unsustainable to regenerative. That might be 4 or 5 years while the soils are actually, getting back into good heart again, and the system starts to function and actually become a lot more effective and efficient. And so there's a real need to help farmers bridge that gap, reduce that risk of their early experimentation. If they make the odd mistake, you pay for it hard in farming because you only get one season, one chance a year to get it right. And so I think a combination of the new public money for public goods coming out of DEFRA post-Brexit, that's going to be really important. I think there are opportunities through green finance, things like biodiversity net gain, and then supply chains who really are going to need to think about where their food's coming from in the longer term. They've been able to pick and choose, source all over the globe, and they will probably still need to source stuff globally because we don't know where climate impacts are going to hit hardest, when, but actually really committing to their farmer groups. Farmers have now got options about doing other things. They can get money for, carbon capture and biodiversity. They don't have to produce food. So the supply chain, if it wants to thrive, is going to have to support those farmers in transition as well. So I think that knowledge gap and that finance gap are the things that we most need to be concentrating on.
Well, hopefully we can address some of that finance conversation in the panel. And my final question before we get on with that is, how applicable are the concepts you're talking about beyond the UK, beyond Europe, all around the world, into the developing economies where there's different climates, where many, many people rely on very small farms to survive? What's the kind of global picture look like in terms of where we're trying to head?
The benefits are even greater in many countries where soils are fragile and climate is even more erratic than it is here. There's lots of work showing that in places like sub-Saharan Africa, when you go down an organic or regenerative route and you build up your soils, you can use less inputs. Those inputs are held better within the soils, yields increase. So in the UK, we tend to think of when you go organic, or even sometimes when you go regenerative, that you're going to reduce your yields because the sort of status quo on that is a very high input system. In countries where they can't afford those inputs or where the soils are even more fragile, you quite rapidly get yield improvements beyond what they can achieve just using chemicals if they can afford them, and in many cases they can't. So there's a really strong benefits in more vulnerable communities and climatic regions. And reversing desertification is going to be a big issue. Deserts have been encroaching on farmland for many decades now. And thinking about how we do that with trees and shade and animals, again, there's some great case studies of how we've been able to reverse desertification in these fragile economies. And we did some work a while ago looking at cotton farmers who went organic in India, and found that not only were they getting a better price for their cotton because it was organic, but actually even more importantly, because they were then having to farm in rotation rather than just growing one crop, they had higher household food security than they'd had before, and a wider variety of cash crops to sell too. So these things are, they're important in a UK context, in a European context. They're probably absolutely vital in areas of the world where malnutrition, vulnerable soils, and climate impacts are going to hit hardest.
I mean, it really is a virtuous cycle that you're trying to create with this message and with this transition. So, good luck to you with your continued work at the Soil Association. Thank you so much for taking the time to set the scene for us ahead of our panel. That was fascinating. Cheers.
Well, it's great to be with you. And anybody who wants to know more about the work of the Soil Association, do get in touch. We'd love to engage with you.
Great. Well, thanks again to Helen, and do visit the Soil Association booth, which you can find in the exhibitors area of the platform. There's more information on the charity, on Soil Association Exchange, and various links there. So do check that out. And now we're going to move on to the panel discussion. So we will be back in a few moments.